If the maxim falsum in uno falsum in omnibus, false in one point, false in all, were to be received without qualification, the credit of Savage's narrative as conveyed to us would be annihilated. For it contains some assertions which, beyond a question, are not true. Number one, in order to induce a belief that Earl Rivers, on account of a criminal connection with whom Lady Macclesfield is said to have been divorced from her husband by Act of Parliament, had a peculiar anxiety about the child which she bore to him, it is alleged that his lordship gave him his own name and had it duly recorded in the register of St. Andrews, Holborn. I have carefully inspected that register, but no such entry is to be found. Footnote here. The story on which Mr. Cutts so much relies that Savage was a supposititious child, not the son of Lord Rivers and Lady Macclesfield, but the offspring of a shoemaker, introduced in consequence of her real son's death, was without doubt grounded on the circumstances of Lady Macclesfield's having, in 1696, previously to the birth of Savage, had a daughter by the Earl Rivers, who died in her infancy, a fact which was proved in the course of the proceeding on Lord Macclesfield's bill of divorce. Most fictions of this kind have some admixture of truth in them. But he was apparently not the son of this person, maybe. Number two, it is stated that Lady Macclesfield, having lived for some time upon very uneasy terms with her husband, thought a public confession of adultery the most obvious and expeditious method of obtaining her liberty. And Johnson, assuming this to be true, stigmatizes her with indignation as the wretch who had, without scruple, proclaimed herself an adulteress. But I have perused the journals of both Houses of Parliament at the period of her divorce, and there find it authentically, yes, that's how you pronounce it, authentically ascertained that so far from voluntarily submitting to the ignominious charge of adultery, she made a strenuous defense by her counsel. The bill having been first moved 15th January 1697 in the House of Lords, and proceeded on, with various applications for time and bring up witnesses at a distance, etc., at intervals, till the 3rd of March, when it passed. It was brought to the Commons by a message from the Lords, the 5th of March, proceeded on the 7th, 10th, 11th, 14th, and 15th, on which day, after a full examination of witnesses on both sides, and hearing of counsel, it was reported without amendments passed and carried to the Lords. Lady Macclesfield was convicted of the crime of which she was accused, cannot be denied. But the question now is whether the person calling himself Richard Savage was her son. Okay, I gotta read back on this. So she committed adultery and was convicted of adultery, I believe. But was she Richard Savage's mother? Let's find out. It has been said that when Earl Rivers was dying and anxious to provide for all his natural children, he was informed by Lady Macclesfield that her son by him was dead. Whether then shall we believe that this was a malignant lie invented by a mother to prevent her own child from receiving the bounty of his father, which was accordingly the consequence if the person whose life Johnson wrote was her son? Or shall we not rather believe that the person who then assumed the name of Richard Savage was an impostor, being in reality the son of the shoemaker, under whose wife's care Lady Macclesfield's child was placed? That after the death of the real Richard Savage, he attempted to personate him, and that the fraud being known to Lady Macclesfield, he was therefore repulsed by her with just resentment. Okay, getting all this? It's like Agatha Christie over here. There is a strong circumstance in support of the last supposition, though it has been mentioned as an aggravation of Lady Macclesfield's unnatural conduct, and that is her having prevented him from obtaining the benefit of legacy left to him by Mrs. Lloyd, his godmother. For if there was such a legacy left, his not being able to obtain payment of it must be imputed to his consciousness that he was not the real person. The just inference should be that by the death of Lady Macclesfield's child before its godmother, the legacy became lapsed, and therefore this Johnson's Richard Savage was an impostor. If he had a title to the legacy, he could not have found any difficulty in recovering it, for had the executors resisted his claim, the whole cost, as well as the legacy, must have been paid by them, if he had been the child to whom it was given. The talents of Savage and the mingled fire, rudeness, pride, meanness, and ferocity of his character concur in making it credible that he was fit to plan and carry on an ambitious and daring scheme of imposture, similar instances of which have not been wanting in higher spheres, in the history of different countries, and have had a considerable degree of success. Johnson's companion appears to have persuaded that lofty-minded man that he resembled him in having a noble pride, for Johnson, after painting in strong colours the quarrel between Lord Tyrconnel and Savage, asserts that the spirit of Mr. Savage, indeed, never suffered him to solicit a reconciliation. He returned reproach for reproach and insult for insult. But the respectable gentleman to whom I have alluded had in his possession a letter from Savage, after Lord Tyrconnel had discarded him, addressed to the Reverend Mr. Gilbert, his lordship's chaplain, in which he requested him, in the humblest manner, to represent his case for the Viscount. Viscount? Yet, on the other hand, to the companion of Johnson, who, though whatever medium he was conveyed into this world, be it ever so doubtful to whom related, or by whom begot, was unquestionably a man of no common endowments, we must allow the weight of general repute as to his status or parentage, though illicit. And supposing him to be an impostor, it seems strange that Lord Tyrconnel, the nephew of Lady Macclesfield, should patronize him, and even admit him as a guest in his family. Trusting to Savage's information, Johnson represents this unhappy man's being received as a companion by Lord Tyrconnel and pensioned by his lordship, as if posterior to Savage's conviction and pardon. But I am assured that Savage had received the voluntary bounty of Lord Tyrconnel, and had been dismissed by him long before the murder was committed, and that his lordship was very instrumental in procuring Savage's pardon by his intercession with the Queen through Lady Hertford. If, therefore, he had been desirous of preventing the publication by Savage, he would have left him to his fate. Indeed, I must observe that although Johnson mentions that Lord Tyrconnel's patronage of Savage was, upon his promise to lay aside his design of exposing the cruelty of his mother, the great biographer has forgotten that he himself had mentioned that Savage's story had been told several years before in The Plain Dealer, from which he quotes the strong saying of the generous Sir Richard Steele that, and I quote, "the inhumanity of his mother had given him a right to find every good man his father." Unquote. At the same time, it must be acknowledged that Lady Macclesfield and her relations might still wish that her story should not be brought into more conspicuous notice by the satirical pen of Savage. Lastly, it must ever appear very suspicious that 3 different accounts of the life of Richard Savage, one published in the Plain Dealer in 1724, another in 1727, and another by the powerful pen of Johnson in 1744, and all of them, while Lady Macclesfield was alive, should, notwithstanding the severe attacks upon her, have been suffered to pass without any public and effectual contradiction. Okay. I have thus endeavored to sum up the evidence upon the case as fairly as I can. And the result seems to be that the world most vibrate in a state of uncertainty as to what was the truth. This digression, I trust, will not be censured as it relates to a matter exceedingly curious and very intimately connected with Johnson, both as a man and as an author. Miss Mason, after having forfeited the title of Lady Macclesfield by divorce, was married to Colonel Brett, and, it is said, was well known in all the polite circles. Colley Cibber, I am informed, had so high an opinion of her taste and judgment as to genteel life and manners that he submitted every scene of his careless husband to Mrs. Brett's revival and correction. Colonel Brett was reported to be too free in his gallantry with his lady's maid. Ooh. Mrs. Brett came into a room one day in her own house and found the colonel and her maid both fast asleep in 2 chairs. She tied a white handkerchief round her husband's neck, which was a sufficient proof that she had discovered his intrigue. But she never at any time took notice of it to him. This incident, I am told, gave occasion to the well-wrought scene of Sir Charles and Lady Easy in Edging. Anyway, getting back to Johnson. He this year, we're talking 1745, I believe now, wrote the preface to the Harleian Miscellany. The selection of the pamphlets of which it was composed was made by Mr. Oldies, a man of eager curiosity and indefatigable. They love this word that I can't pronounce back then. Indefatigable, you know what I mean. Diligence, who first exerted that spirit of inquiry into the literature of the old English writers, by which the works of our great dramatic poet have of late been so signally illustrated. In 1745, he published a pamphlet entitled Miscellaneous Observations on the Tragedy of Macbeth, with remarks on Sir T.H. Thomas's, that's Sir Thomas Hammer's, edition of Shakespeare, to which he affixed proposals for a new edition of that poet. As we do not trace anything else published by him during the course of this year, we may conjecture that he was occupied entirely with that work. But the little encouragement which was given by the public to his anonymous proposals for the execution of a task which Warburton was known to have undertaken probably damped his ardor. His pamphlet, however, was highly esteemed, and was fortunate enough to obtain the approbation even of the supercilious Warburton himself, who, in the preface to his Shakespeare, published 2 years afterwards, thus mentioned it, and I quote, "As to all those things which have been published under the title of Essays, Remarks, Observations, and etc. on Shakespeare, if you accept some critical notes on Macbeth, given as a specimen of a projected edition and written as appears by a man of parts and genius, the rest are absolutely below a serious notice." Oh, okay, so I think there on each page there's the top. It's kind of neat. I wish I did this in more books. The year we're talking about, so this is 1747, and then over here it says Etat 38. So I believe that's how old Boswell is. Johnson is in this section. So that's kind of cool. He's about. Well, I don't want to. He's about my age in this section. Time travel. Neat. Now, this flattering distinction shown to him by Warburton a very grateful remembrance was ever entertained by Johnson, who said, "He praised me at a time when praise was of value to me." In 1746, when he was 37, in 1746 it is probable that he was still employed upon his Shakespeare, which perhaps he laid aside for a time upon account of the high expectations which were formed of Warburton's edition of that great poet. It is somewhat curious that his literary career appears to have been almost totally suspended in the years 1745 and 1746, those years which were marked by a civil war in Great Britain, when a rash attempt was made to restore the House of Stuart to the throne. Hope that's not going to happen here. That he had a tenderness for that unfortunate house is well known, and some may fancifully agree that a sympathetic anxiety impeded the exertion of his intellectual powers. But I am inclined to think that he was, during this time, sketching the outlines of his great philological work. None of his literary letters during these years are extant, as far as I can discover. This is much to be regretted. It might afford some entertainment to see how he then expressed himself to his private friends concerning state affairs. Dr. Adams informs me that at this time a favorite object which he had in contemplation was the Life of Alfred, in which, from the warmth with which he spoke about it, he would, I believe, had he been master of his own will, had engaged himself rather than on any other subject. In 1747, when he was 38, it is supposed that the Gentleman's Magazine for May was enriched by him with 5 short poetical pieces distinguished by 3 asterisks. The first is a translation, or rather a paraphrase, of a Latin epitaph on Sir Thomas Hammer. Whatever the Latin was, his or not, I have never heard, though I should think it probably was, if it be as certain that he wrote the English. As to which my only cause of doubt is that his slighting character of Hammer as an editor in his observations on Macbeth is very different from that in the epitaph. It may be said that there is the same contrary between the characters in the observations and that in his own preface to Shakespeare. But a considerable time elapsed between the one publication and the other, whereas the observations and the epitaph came close together. Isn't this fascinating? The others are 2 myths on his giving the author a gold and silk net worth purse of her own weaving, Stella in Mourning, The Winter's Walk, an ode, and 2 lice, an elderly lady. Lease, an elderly lady? I'm not positive that all these were his productions, but as The Winter's Walk has never been controverted to be his, and all of them have the same mark, it is reasonable to conclude that they are all written by the same hand. In The Universal Visitor, to which Johnson contributed, the mark which is affixed to some pieces unquestionably is his. It is also found subjoined to others, of which he certainly was not the author. The marks, therefore, will not ascertain the poems in question to have been written by him. They were probably the productions of Hawkesworth, who, it is believed, was afflicted with the gout. Where was I? They were written by the same man. Yet, to the ode, in which we find a passage very characteristic of him, being a learned description of the gout, unhappy, whom to beds of pain arthritic tyranny consigns. There is also the following note. The author being ill of the gout. But Johnson was not attacked with this distemper till at a very late period in his life. May not this, however, be a poetical fiction? Why may not a poet suppose himself to have the gout, as well as suppose himself to be in love, of which we have innumerable instances, and which has been admirably ridiculed by Johnson in his Life of Cowley? I have also some difficulty to believe that he could produce such a group of conceits as appear in the verses to Lice, or Lys, in which he claims for this ancient personage as good a right to be assimilated to heaven as nymphs who other poets have flattered. He therefore ironically ascribes to her the attributes of the sky, in such stanzas as this. Her teeth, the night, where darkness dies, she's starred with pimples o'er, her tongue like nimble lightning plies, and can with thunder roar. But at a very advanced age he could condescend to trifle in namby-pamby rhymes to please Mrs. Thrale and her daughter. He may have, in his early years, composed such a piece as this. Namby-pamby rhymes. Anyway, that's it for now. Bye from Boswell.